Hello everyone. We're going to be discussing week 4, which is chemical safety. This is one that's a big important one, particularly for welders and fabricators, because of all the chemicals we're working around, not just inhaling, but also the chemicals that we sometimes are throwing sparks on or grinding or possibly trying to ignite and so forth. So starting out here, we're going to walk through this PowerPoint and a slideshow, we'll discuss some of the important pieces of it and so forth. Alright, so the objectives for this chapter, at the end of this lesson, you should be able to define the terms chemical hazard, physical hazard, and health hazard. Okay, list 3 kinds of physical hazards, name and describe the various health hazards, as well as identify common symptoms of chemical exposure, and list 3 health exposure routes. Additionally, list 3 ways to control chemical health hazards and exposures. And finally, explain basic first aid procedures for chemical exposure. We're going to start off with chemical hazards. Any chemical that can cause illness, injury, or create an emergency situation is considered a hazard. Okay? Chemicals are everywhere. Some are more hazardous than others. WD-40 is flammable. Everything has a flash point within it. Okay? So all chemicals must be labeled, and SDS sheets must be available for review. Now, sometimes if you're working in a shop with older folks, you'll hear of it called an MSDS, because that's what we used to call it till a couple years ago. Now with global manufacturing, we've taken away the M. So it was material safety data sheet, and now we're just calling it safety data sheets. Okay? But basically, this is going to give you the overexposure of what everything should look like. It'll tell you the flash points, the reactivity of it, so forth. We'll see a few of these things as we're going through this chapter. Okay? The amount of exposure to these chemicals should be minimized even when they are considered safe. So, how do you know if they're safe or not? The first thing you can do is number one, you should find the SDS sheet, right? And on the SDS sheet, it will tell you whether it's considered safe, what's the flash point, and then you can start to figure out from that point how safe is it and so forth. Okay? There are safe ways to handle and use these chemicals, but you have to know the hazards and how to mitigate them. Kind of what we just explained from this point on. We'll give you all the information, but you have to be able to depict what the hazards are and how to mitigate them. Chemicals exist in all physical forms: solids, dust and fumes, liquids, vapors and mists, and gases, but may also exist as vapors, mists, dust, and fumes. The physical form of the chemical can determine the way it gets into your body. So naturally, solids can be ingested. You can swallow some of them, but typically, mainly this is the case where you're going to get it through inhalation, dust and fumes. So respiratory breathers and so forth are important for us as welders to be concerned with, having fresh air in a confined space. Masking up, going underneath for SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus, and so forth. Liquids, vapors, and mists. Now, for the most part, we're not going to be welding underwater, but sometimes it's looking around you, what you're working on, or what you're cutting into or welding on that might have vapors or mist inside of them. So, we talk about 55-gallon drums and barbecuers and people doing things like that, and they go to cut it open with a torch and they didn't know it had a flammable liquid in it, and it blows up and kills them or hurts them very badly. And gases, but may also exist as vapors, mist, dust, and fumes. And a lot of you, when we talked about the first section of the safety in the introduction, you know the story of my father welding into a tank, or cutting into a tank, a transformer tank, and the oil embedded within, the oil embedded within the metal. Once it's heated up, it starts to turn into a gas, and it creates phosgene gas, which then is flammable at that point. Not only just bad for inhalation and oxygen depriving, but also very flammable. Right? Okay. So the next one, we're going to kind of wrap this one up here. The main hazards for chemicals are broken into 2 groups. So we're going to break these groups down even further. Number 1 is a health hazard, and number 2 is the physical hazard. So let's discuss health hazards first. The health hazards are chemicals that can cause illness or injury when inhaled, swallowed, or touched, and are broken down into 6 categories. Again, inhaled, swallowed, or touched. And we haven't thought about touched a lot, but particularly on liquid. You'll see this in a lot of machinists when they're dealing with chemicals and acetone, that you start to get that absorption into your skin system, okay? And it can cause some serious issues like irritants and so forth, right? So the 6 categories are broken out into irritants, corrosives, sensitizers, target organ chemicals, the reproductive hazards, and then carcinogens, okay? So irritants irritate or inflame human tissue on contact. Few of these can be as serious as Coca-Cola would, right? I mean, anybody that's been around it, like if it gets wet and gets on your skin, it's a very serious irritant. It can make you a big issue. Some magnesium can do this as well. It's heavy enough that you're usually not inhaling it, and you might get it from absorption by touching it, and so forth. The other one is corrosives. Can cause visible destruction or damage to tissue on contact. The easiest one for this is to think of like an acid base, right? So if it's an acid base, it's going to start eating away, creating an issue within your skin and deteriorating it and so forth. Sensitizers can cause an allergic response on people who are repeatedly exposed to a substance. So the first time or two you might get away with it, but being around it all the time might become an issue, or it might inflame asthma, all right? And sometimes we'll see this in beginning welders, and then they kind of get used to it from the fumes and the metal and the iron, and it kind of goes away for a little bit. But if you're seeing any of these major problems, please let us know. Target organ chemicals, which damage specific organs or body systems, all right? The reproductive hazards can cause sterility, fetal injury, or birth defects. And out of those 2, that's broken up into 2 other parts. Mutagens can permanently damage the genes in the egg or the sperm. And I'm trying to remember how to pronounce this. Teratogens are a type of hazard that can damage the fetus during pregnancy, causing either death or birth defects. And then last but not least is carcinogens, which cause cancer or have the potential to cause cancer down the line. Okay? All right. Let's recognize chemical exposure effects. Here we talked about the health hazards. Now we're moving on to the chemical exposure, right? Some chemical exposures are obvious, but many are not, and these may result in medical systems that can warn you that exposure has occurred. Some symptoms are nausea, headache, dizziness, throat irritation, and coughing. These are generally fairly quick in onset. Now, taking this into consideration, there was one time self-shielded wire puts off a tremendous amount of fumes. Okay, so let me define that a little further. Flux core self-shielded wire, to where it doesn't have an outside gas shielding as well. It's only the flux that comes in the tube of the flux core welding. Puts off a tremendous amount of smoke. It's usually burned very hot and so forth. And I remember one time working in a bucket. It was a dragline bucket, but I had my head over top of this and ended up getting between the fume plume and the exit, and it was in the open air, so I didn't think too much about it. But I actually passed out from too much inhalation, and it made me really dizzy and nausea. And so luckily when I passed out from it, my finger came off the trigger with the self-shielded, and it quit doing that, and I was in open air, so it didn't take too long for me to come back to regain consciousness, I should say. Okay. Moving on to the next bullet point, knowing the symptoms of a specific chemical exposure and being able to identify these symptoms quickly can get you from getting additional exposure. And the SDS will do this too. Like if you get it in your eyes, if you breathe the fumes or something like that, it'll give you a remedy of what to do. Drink water for so long to induce vomiting. If it's at exposure, try to get you to get it out of your system and so forth. And the last bullet point here, keep in mind that symptoms do not mean you have been exposed to something, but they can provide a data point when assessing your situation. Your history and the timing of the onset of symptoms can help identify if you have had a reaction to a chemical exposure. So if you frequently get headaches and get one while welding a product you have welded many times before without an issue, it may be unrelated to your workplace activities. And particularly on this, there's a lot of times like you're welding on different material, but then for some of you, as we get into galvanized welding, the galvanized fume will make you really sick. The old adage is to go home and drink a little bit of milk, it'll help settle your stomach. But what you've done is you started to be exposure of nausea, headaches, dizziness, and then it'll generally go into giving you an upset stomach. The zinc coating around Unistrut can do the same thing, and so forth. So some of the coatings that we deal with on our metal have a different effect than just plain steel and what we might deal with here in class. Alright, let's look at the different exposure routes. Okay, the exposure routes are 4 basic routes: chemical exposure on the job, inhalation, which is breathing it in, ingestion, which is swallowing it, absorption through skin contact, and then there's an injection, right? And when we get an injection, we can always talk about like impaling yourself on a liquid injection, like a pipe or something, but you can also get it from air as well. Particularly in welding, we deal with a lot of high pressure air, and that air can get inside of your skin, which is a bad deal. Okay, let's talk about inhalation first. Airborne contaminants that can be inhaled directly into the lungs through the nose or through the mouth. These contaminants include dust, mist, fumes, vapors, and gas. Inhalation is the most common route of entry a chemical can take to enter the body. When inhaled, some chemicals enter the bloodstream immediately, and some chemicals accumulate in the lungs and cause damage over time. So one of the things to think about, I'm going to use carbon monoxide right here real quick just for an example. It's a gas, right? And so we inhale it. And one of the reasons that carbon monoxide is so poisonous, number one, it's a bad gas, but it's also attracted to the blood cells, 4 times attracted to the blood cell than an oxygen cell is. So basically it creates a tighter and a better bond. If we're going to use a welding terminology, you might say that it gives it a better fusion to the blood cell than the oxygen would. And so it can easily create a barrier for oxygen entering that bloodstream. Okay, so it's just one example of inhalation. Carbon monoxide is attracted 4 times more than oxygen to the blood cell. All right, let's talk about ingestion. The most common route of ingestion is through eating or drinking contaminated objects, or through eating, drinking, or smoking with contaminants on your hands. This is typically the more of the issue with welding. However, sometimes, you might get a squirt of something, in your eye or your mouth, and it can get ingested in there, right? But typically we're going to work with our hands, and then we take our gloves off and we go eat a sandwich or food or fruit, and those chemicals enter our body through that path. Okay. Absorption. Many chemicals can be absorbed through the skin or can irritate the skin just through contact. Many solvents are absorbed immediately through the skin and enter the bloodstream. Okay, so anytime you're dealing with absorption or a chemical cleaning bath, then we typically want to be wearing either latex or nitrile gloves, depending on your skin allergies and so forth. Okay? Alright. Injection. This is not a common exposure route, but the injuries caused by this method of exposure are extreme. And here we kind of hit on this a little bit earlier. A liquid or gas can be ejected, and even harmless substances can cause great damage, just like compressed air. Most commonly seen in hydraulic work. So anytime you're working around hydraulic hoses, things like that, we need to be extra careful. Be checking while we're wearing our proper PPE, especially when we're unhooking hydraulic hoses, and knowing whether they are pressured or non-pressured and so forth.